Hey, my name's TC Burr. Welcome to Yet, a podcast created to encourage you to get your goal or idea out of your head and into reality. On this podcast, you'll hear stories, encouragements, tips, and ideas to help you write your book, start your business, launch your podcast, or whatever it is you hope to accomplish. Because it's not that you haven't done it, it's just that you haven't done it yet. My guest today is Nathaniel Chaney. Nathaniel, how you doing, man?
Hey, I'm doing good. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for joining the show. I love on my show to allow my guests to introduce themselves. I think it's great to hear, the host of a show read a bio, but I always think it's much more interesting to hear from the guests themselves. So if you don't mind, would you take just 30 seconds and share with folks kind of who you are and what you do?
Yeah. So my name is Nathaniel Chaney. During the day, I work in the real estate industry. I do financial analytics and accounting work. To counteract that, the creative part of me, I'm a writer of primarily fantasy and science fiction novels and some short stories here and there. I'm also a member of the Atlanta Writers Group. I chair one of the critique groups for them as well. We've been meeting for over a year now. So kind of run a writer support group for some of my writer friends that I met through D&D. And so then, when I'm not writing and kind of working full time, my wife and I do dog and cat rescue on the side. So there you go.
Oh, awesome. Cool. So you have it sounds like you have a pretty full schedule, a full life. So you're crunching the numbers during the day. You've got the writing thing that you're doing when you're not working. And then you've got the dog rescue and dog and cat rescue, it sounds like, right? So cool,
Yeah.
man. That's awesome. So talk a little bit about it sounds like maybe you've been writing for a while. Talk a little bit about, what got you started writing, how long you've been doing it, and maybe what some of your early inspiration was to start writing.
Okay. So I think like a lot of people, I definitely started writing kind of shorter stories or had novel ideas in high school. Definitely started a couple of novels in high school that didn't go anywhere. And then kind of did that in college as well, a little bit here and there. But my wife and I ride motorcycles. And when I was 27, we rode from San Francisco down to Tierra del Fuego. So from all the way down to the bottom of South America. And so you have hours and hours and hours of time where you're just writing, and I didn't listen to music or anything. So my mind was just able to go. And so on that trip, I had this inspiration for a book, and it was like the first time where the whole story almost just kind of like populated, at least the first time. And so when we got back from that trip, people are always like, oh, what's the inspirational thing that you learned from that trip? What's this life altering thing that happened to you? Right? It's just like, I don't know, like it was just a trip, whatever. But I think for me, I really wanted to take my writing seriously. I really wanted to actually do it, to write this story. And so when I got back from that trip, when I was 27, I started writing on my lunch breaks. So I would go to work, and I would eat my lunch in 10 minutes and then go to the local coffee shop right up the street, and I would write for about 45 minutes on my laptop. And so that was the first book that really kind of started me to writing. I'm 38 now, so I've been writing for about 10 years since then. So
Awesome. So you had this trip, this long motorcycle trip, and you just, as you're driving, you get this idea for a story. And then pretty soon after that, you're back at work and you just jump right in during your lunch breaks. Is that about right?
yeah, that's about right. As I said, it kind of came, I got, and I didn't know anything about writing at that point. I didn't study it in college, and I hadn't read any like writing books or anything like that. Like I hadn't read Saves the Cat Writes a Novel or anything. And so, but I feel like most people, like, as we consume so much media nowadays, that like people kind of have an innate sense of like story and beats and stuff like that. And they maybe don't know what to call it, but they kind of know like, oh, well, this happens here and this happens here. And so being, of course, in the delusion that writers need to just write and not study it, you're a writer or you're not a writer. So yeah, I just jumped right in and started doing it and started pantsing that novel. And it worked until I kind of ran out of road. And then it kind of went squirrely there for a while when I ran out of the story that I'd been telling myself. So
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So yeah, so very similar to my journey. I started a little bit later, so I'm 42 and I started last year. And very first, and writing was kind of one of those things that's always been there as like, hey, it'd be cool to do that at some point, but
mhm.
outside of like school assignments and stuff, never really did. But same thing, like I did not sit down and plot everything out. I just kind of had the idea in my head and I was like, I'm just going to go for it. And so, very similar, like I plowed through, I think I'm up to like 80,000 plus words now, but, I'm also like kind of to your point, like I'm kind of running out of road and now I'm like kind of piecing things together. And I don't know if you're like me, like I wrote a lot of scenes super out of order. So there's like,
Oh,
I
okay.
wrote the ending very early of the story, and now I'm having to piece all these puzzle pieces together. So anyway, interesting to kind of hear from, because I've talked to a lot of people on this show who are hardcore plotters, and it sounds like that's at least not how you started, right?
It's not how I started, and kudos to you being able to write out of order. I'm definitely one of those people that has to write in sequential order. I
Yeah.
just it's the way my mind works. Right? I'm the accountant, right? So everything has to go in order. Um, but yeah, so I feel like people starting out pantsing is like very natural for a lot of people
Yeah.
because it's just you get the idea and then you're like, well, I'm just going to run with it, I'm just going to do it. But one of the things I've learned as I've with each book, I've kind of learned a lot, and for me, I've definitely learned that like plotting out things has helped dramatically the longer I've gone, the longer
Yeah.
I've gone on. And so the last book that I wrote was the most plotted book that I'd ever done. I did like a complete outline before I even started. And one of the things that has taught me, that my third book taught me in particular, because that one was the similar where I kind of had an outline up to the up to the midpoint, and then I pants the whole second half of that book. And what ended up happening is that when I got into my edits, is that there was a bunch of structural problems with that book. And
Yeah.
I really learned the pain of when you change something in the middle of a book, it has ripple effects, right?
Yeah. Right.
And so it ripples throughout the whole thing. And so I ended up having to rewrite the second half of that book almost again, right? And
Yeah.
so after
Yeah.
that, I was like, I don't want to have that pain again. So I think I'm going to try to do this, try to plot it out a little bit more beforehand.
Yeah.
So,
So that's funny. Yeah, I tell people all the time, like there's certainly like there's no one way to write a book, right? And there's a reason why some people do it one way, some people do it the other. But like I tell people, if you do the pantsing thing, like you still have to end up feathering in structure and building in you're basically
yeah,
outlining just later in the process, right? So that's kind
exactly.
of you got to kind of pick your poison there, I think. But that's interesting. So okay, so 10 years ago, 11 years ago, you started your very first book, and I think you've done a couple more since then, right? So talk about your journey after that first one. What have you been doing since then?
Yeah. So that first one, I think, took me about 3 years. Stopped for a big chunk in the middle of that
Okay.
because I didn't plot it out. I got lost, right?
Yeah.
So I finished that one, and then the year that I finished that one, I finished my second book. I've kind of been writing them kind of collectively, and so I finished both of those in the same year. The year after that, I spent editing them and sending them to beta readers and doing all these things I've never done before. Right? Like, what are beta readers? How does that work? What do I need from them? So both of those books were great in just learning the process of what comes after writing a book, right?
Mm,
Because originally it had started out and I was like, I just want to write, I just want to finish something. I had started so many books and I had never finished one. And so it was all about just, well, I want to finish it. And then once I did that, it was then, well, then what do I do now? Right. And so I learned so much in editing those books. I think I learned more in editing them than I did in writing it.
mm,
Just about structure and characters and all the kind of like tools in the tool belt and stuff. And so all of that kind of helped me hone a process together. So then that next book that I wrote, my third book, I was able to write that book, which was about 105,000 words in 45 days.
oh wow.
So really honed craft to do that, right? And and then each book I've been able to kind of, I learned that for me, I need to get that rough draft done, the crappy first draft. I'll keep it
Yeah.
PC, right? I need to get that there, because then once I have it, I can start manipulating it and changing it and doing all of that. But if I don't have that lump of clay, it's, there's not a whole lot doing there. So
Yeah. 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 That's the kind of the old cliche. Like you can't edit a blank page, right? You got to get it out there, and then, your journey's all in a lot of ways just beginning at that point. Right. Yeah.
exactly. And that's why when some people are like, the whole idea of like, like everything's writing, and stuff. And I'm like, well, yes, I don't disagree with that. I'm like, research is okay, is writing, and like studying is somewhat akin to writing, but it really is, like button seat. You know what I mean? And as
Yeah,
mean as that is sometimes when people say that, it's like you have to actually do the work. And
for sure.
so I think that's the struggle sometimes, I think, for people is, and one of the things I've learned too is that, like, and I don't know if you found this when you were writing it, like the whole idea of like needing to be inspired
Mm,
versus just doing it. And for a
yeah.
while there when I was younger, I was like, well, I have to be inspired to write and create and stuff like that. And what I found is that, like, at least for me, I don't, like, I just have to set that goal for myself, and I need to meet my goal, whatever, if it's word count, if it's writing time, whatever it
Yeah.
is, I just need to do it, because I often find, on the days where it's hard, if I just force myself and do it, I eventually get to that place where the words start to come, and it's painful, but I think it is doable. So
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I totally agree. Sometimes it's just about putting in the reps, building the habit, and powering through on those days. Because the truth is, like, and most writers, I'm sure, once you sit down to write, like there are going to be days when you are super inspired, but there are probably
mhm.
more days than not when you're just okay. I just need to power through this, write this scene, write this chapter, write these words, and then, like you said, you polish them up, and you finalize, and you tweak it after the fact, but you got to get it on the page first. And I think you're right. Like, people say research is writing and rest is writing, and I don't like you, I don't disagree, but sometimes I think we can use those as almost like smoke screens, because we are feeling the lack of inspiration, or we're feeling the writer's block, and we're kind of like putting off the actual, like you say, the butt in seat, fingers on the keys, like, let's go. Yeah, totally agree. Okay, so
Yeah,
it sounds like
yeah.
you have learned quite a bit, Nathaniel, over the course of your decade or so of writing, and it seems like quite a journey. From, I mean, I can tell just by the way you're talking. Like, you seem like you've become somebody from the very beginning, somebody who just kind of dove in and started going. Now it seems like you have a much more structured process. Seems like you've kind of become a craft guy when it comes to writing. So I'm curious if you could share, and you probably, you've got 10 years worth of knowledge that you've gleaned, and we don't have 10 years worth of time today, but if you could just share a couple of the highlights, like some of the biggest lessons that you've learned, that if you could talk to yourself 10 years ago, like, what are some of those things you would say, hey man, no matter what, make sure you do this or don't do this? What are a couple of those?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is, and it gets talked about a lot, but it's like it's all about silencing that inner critic. I think that's been one of the big things, and learning, like we've already kind of talked about, but like learning that writing is a process and that revision is a big part of writing. And I
Mm,
think when I was first starting out, it was like everything has to be perfect. Every word needs to be perfect. If it's not perfect, I need to stop and I need to fix it right now. And that just leads to a very, at least for me, destructive place, where it's like, then I second guess everything and then I just stop and I just shut
yeah.
down, right? And that's not really good for creativity and imagination and all that stuff. And so I think it's like the first thing is like, and the inner critic is always the thing that took me a long time to realize is that voice in the back of my head that says, well, like, this isn't good enough to be published, or this isn't, people aren't going to like this, or something. It's always the external thing that I want that's putting that pressure on there, right? Like it's not good enough for other people to read. It's not good enough to be
Mm,
published. It's not good enough to get an agent or whatever, right? And so at least in that first draft, as much as possible, I try to just like let that stuff go and write the story that I want to read, that I want to tell myself, you know?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then after that is when you have to then come back and say, okay, what's here that's working, and what's here that isn't working, you know?
Sure. Yeah. 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 Oh, that's great. That's great. I love it. Okay. So one of the things that I've tried, the kind of big goal for this podcast, I want to get this stories like yours into the ears of other potential writers, people who are thinking about writing, thinking of got an idea, but maybe feel like I could never do it. And so, because I think that hearing kind of real life examples of people who have decided, hey, I've put this off long enough, I want to go for it. Hearing those stories can kind of encourage and inspire other people to do the same thing. And I have long said, and I will say this until the day I die, I think the world needs more great stories. And like, it pains me to think about how many great stories have gone unwritten because somebody doesn't have enough encouragement, or doesn't have the, doesn't feel like they're in the club as far as like a creative who can actually do something like that. So I'm
Yeah.
curious, from your perspective, have there been any moments that you would point to, or words that you would point to in your journey, that where somebody has said or done something that's been super encouraging for you?
Yeah, I know. I'm trying, let's see. It's really, I think that comes down to, there was a time in my first book that first one that took me like 2.5 years to write, and I had stopped writing it, and it was eating away at me, and it was just another one of those books that I hadn't finished, right? And it was just like, I didn't want that to be the case. And so I was talking with my wife about it. My wife is super encouraging, which is, kudos to all of the spouses out there that
Yeah.
support them, and all the writer moms, all the author moms that read our crappy first drafts and still
Oh
support
yeah.
us, right? Like, thank
Yeah.
you so much. And so I was talking with her about it, and I was just like, I don't know what to do, and but I want to get back into it. And she looked at me, and she said, the name of the character in the book was Penna. It was a little girl, and she said, "You've abandoned Penna. You've abandoned her,"
Mm.
and that hurt so much. Like I wanted the character to live out the rest of that story, for her, the rest of her story to be told, right? And I don't normally think of my characters as real people, and I don't really like talk to them the way that other authors might, but that was the one where it was like, no, that I really do want this story to be told, even if it's just to me. And I love that first book. But I've trunked it. I might go back to it someday, a long time from now, and like rewrite it or something. But it just knowing that book is done has meant so much. And so like just my wife saying that really gave me the umph to like get back into it and finish it. And that has really made all the difference, because
Yeah.
finishing that book like showed me that I could, and spurred everything else beyond that. And if I hadn't finished that book, I don't think that I would be writing the way that I am today. It would have just
Yeah.
moved on.
That's great, man. I love what you said there. Like, being able to see yourself finish the book kind of prove to yourself that you could do it. Like, if I'm paraphrasing what you said, but like, I think that's
Yep.
so important, man. Like, all of us, everybody who I've brought on this podcast has shared at some point something along the lines of, I've really had to deal with imposter syndrome, right? It seems like it's kind of the epidemic that's gotten all of us at some point. And if you can start to stack up some wins and have some objective evidence to point to the contrary, like, that's so powerful. So even if it's just something as small as like putting 500 words down on a page, like, you look at
Yeah.
that the next day and think, you might wake up feeling uninspired, but then you look back and say, well, I did it yesterday. Why can't I do it again today? So I mean, yeah, who knows what might have happened if you had never finished that first one? Maybe there wouldn't be a second or a third, right? How many books are you
Yeah.
up to now, Nathaniel?
So I'm editing my fifth one now. So
Wow.
a couple of those were just fun projects. They were just projects that were just for me, that I didn't write with aspirations of publication or anything like that. But yeah, so yeah, on the fifth one now, so it's
Awesome.
trying to chunk away a little bit. So
That's great, man. And by the way, the fun ones still count. Like, I want to make sure we get that on the record. Like, the ones that you write for yourself, like, those still count. Like, that's awesome.
definitely, yeah, no, I didn't want to give that impression. They 100% count, and in fact, like that was one of the things I was thinking about before I came on here, is the whole idea of like, for the first one, just pick the one that you're like, maybe don't pick the one that you've had in your mind that you've wanted to write forever, right? Like maybe save that one for the next one, because I think
Yeah.
sometimes you hear people where they're like, I'm starting out, it's my first book, and it's going to be the first book of a 10-book trilogy of epic fantasy books, and they're all going to be 800 pages long, right? And I'm like,
Right.
that is awesome. I'm super stoked for you. Maybe write an 80,000 word novel first as
Yes.
a warm up, and then write that series,
Yeah.
and not to discourage people. Like, there are people that can do it for sure. Like, if you're confident and you can do it, that's great. For me, sometimes it's easy, like, write the fun stuff, write the stuff you're excited about, but also maybe always don't necessarily write from a place of like, and this is going to be published, right? Because you may get to the end of that one and be like, this is a mess. I
Not the
loved
one.
it. It was exciting. I'm so glad I finished it, and I'm ready for the next one,
Yeah, and I mean, I think we also have to make sure we're having a right definition of what success looks like too. So I think, for many people, you start off and think, okay, if I don't hit every bestseller list and see my book on the shelf in the bookstore, then I have failed. And that's absolutely not the case. Like, making progress on your thing is success. And especially if you get to the point where you finish writing a draft and go through the editing process and all of that, like, man, if nobody else ever reads that thing, you get to say for the rest of your life that you wrote a book. Like, how cool is that? I heard a stat recently, you've probably heard this, something like 80% of Americans say they want to write a book, but only 1% ever do. Like, so you're among a pretty elite class of people just for doing it, which is pretty crazy to think about.
It is, and and I love that when people, I agree, like, you have to, it's it's sometimes recontextualizing success. I love that you said that, because it is about like just getting 250 words on the page. That's a success for that day,
Yes.
like finishing is a success, like editing, getting a beta read, like every one of those things, like celebrate your successes. And that's one of the things that my writer support group, we're not about critique. We're really more about just checking in with each other. And it's just 4 people on a Discord server, and we meet, very infrequently, but it's all about, hey, I did this today, and everybody's just super supportive of each other. So that's another thing too. If you can find other authors or people that you kind of vibe with that are in the same creative space, and share with them, because just knowing that they're there. And me, like, when I was writing my last book, I would go on there and be like, oh, I did this today, or I'm halfway through, and like the cheers that I got from them, like, it means so much, and it really does help a lot. So, but celebrate the wins, celebrate all the wins.
That's awesome. Yeah, cool. Hey, I just have a few more questions and I'll let you get out of here. So, you mentioned earlier, or we talked a little bit about kind of your journey and how you've kind of leaned into the craft of writing. It sounds like you mentioned a couple resources. I think you talked about Save the Cat earlier. I'm curious, what are some of the other maybe books, podcasts, any other resources or tools that you would point people to help them in their writing journey?
Yeah, so to do a little bit of self promotion, I do have a resource section on my blog, which is ChaneyWrites.com, where all of these are listed as well. But the couple of Saves the Cat writes a novel. I would suggest that for anybody who's like just getting started out. I think you've read it. Like, it's great. It's, I would just suggest for anybody to read that. Use the beat sheet and just go to town with that one. If you're really looking into getting more into like plotting and how that works, and you want kind of a step-by-step process, Lisa Krone's Story Genius is epic. It's really great. I've used that one several times for couple of my novels, and it's helped out immensely in getting into more of a plotting mind frame and character development and all of that kind of stuff. I wouldn't be an author if I didn't throw out Stephen King's On Writing. I feel like that's a great one for everybody to kind of dip their toes into. I'm not super into everything that he says in that, but he says a lot of great stuff, and he clearly has had some success, I think we can say.
He knows what
So,
he's
and
doing.
then
Yeah.
doing. And then the final one I'll throw out there is books that are kind of more in the vein of just like random writing advice. And this one's maybe a little bit random. It's Consider This: Moments in My Writing Life After Which Everything Was Different. And that one's actually by Chuck Palahniuk, who wrote Fight Club, if people remember that.
Oh, yeah.
It's very much in the style of On Writing, where he mixes in his own personal memoir journey of writing. But there's a lot of little tidbits that are like really applicable, like right off the bat. Like things like they're not really deep things that you have to think about. It's just immediate things that you can kind of implement almost instantaneously in your writing. And then there's some that you don't, there's some that you love, and there's some that you're like, I'm never going to do that. Right. But I really enjoyed that. So
Awesome. That's great. Well, Nathaniel, this has been really fun. Thank you so much for coming on the show, sharing all your wisdom and sharing a little bit about your journey. Just one last question before I let you get out of here. How do people connect with you and follow along with some of the stuff that you're doing?
Oh yeah. So I'm at Chaney Writes on Threads and Instagram. I'm no longer on X or Twitter or whatever it's called anymore. And then you can
Whatever
also
they're
reach out to
calling
me
it.
on whatever they're calling it today.
Yeah.
And then, if people can go to my website if they're interested in finding those resources. I post a lot of writer resource stuff on my website, which is ChaneyWrites.com.
Oh, awesome.
And I'm ChaneyWrites@gmail.com. If people want to drop me an email there, feel free. I love discussing writing. I love talking with writers about writing. So I'm like you. I just want to talk with people because I love talking about writing with writers. So
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to be cheering you on, man. This is really cool. Thanks.
awesome. Thanks so much for having me on.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to today's episode. If you would do me a huge favor, if you got value out of this podcast, which I'm assuming maybe you did since you're still here, would you scroll down to the bottom of your podcast app and rate and review the show? And maybe share it with someone on social media or with a friend, just in a conversation. It would mean so much to get this message out to more people, and I think it would be amazing if you would share it. So that would be, as a personal favor to me, I'd really love it. Also, if you want to know more about me and what I'm working on, you can visit my website. It's tcburr.com. I hope you'll check it out. You can contact me there. Thanks again, and I really appreciate it. I'll talk to you soon.